Oh, and welcome to week 13 in plant biology. First of all, I owe you guys an apology. I went back through my recordings from last week and realized that I misspoke. Last week was chapter 25 in biology 2E, sections 1, 2, and 3. That's what I gave you. I said it's only 1 and 2. This week we're going through chapter 25.4, which are when we're talking about the seedless vascular plants. So disregard my early section ramblings about which sections were for last week. This week we're back on track. This is chapter 25.4, the seedless vascular plants in the biology 2E textbook. So last week was sections 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3. This week is 0.4 in chapter 25. So these 2 weeks, regardless, really is covering the seedless plants and sort of the early discussions about plant taxonomy. So apologies for my misspeaking last week. So this week we're going to be talking about chapter 25.4, the seedless vascular plants in the biology 2E textbook. So this continuation in this chapter moves from the bryophytes, which are avascular, so they do not have true vascular tissue that we see in these tracheophytes that we do start to see in these sort of next stages of evolution, which are still, of course, still prevalent on Earth, but as an evolutionary stage, the development of vascular tissue is a major step forward in plant evolution. The bryophytes continue to be a successful group on Earth, and they were the sort of bridge group moving from aquatic photosynthetic organisms to land plants. And so they do have this really important role in this evolutionary history, as well as, currently they do still perform ecosystem services for humans and things like that, and for the planet. But they are no longer the dominant life form or plant life form on this planet, and that's because this development of vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, really represents a major step forward in the ability for plants to survive in a land sort of situation. Early seedless plants still rely on aquatic environments, or at least water for fertilization events in their reproductive strategies, but they are no longer as tied to water as far as the necessity of having a small structure where they're simply diffusing water in and out. Now they start to have this vascular tissue which allows them to move water, at least in the sporophyte generation, move water rapidly and efficiently through their larger body structures. They also start to develop this compound called lignin, which is a complex organic polymer. It's impermeable to water. It provides a lot of strength to these structures, so we start to see these plants growing upwards, competing for light resources as well. So they're able to utilize sort of deeper water sources and move this water through larger structures, so they're better able to compete for light resources, which confers on them an evolutionary advantage. Now, with these seedless plants, again, we still need water for reproduction, but they're not nearly as reliant on water for their just day-to-day functionings that we see with the bryophytes. So we have this development of these vascular tissues, the xylem and the phloem, xylem is the role of xylem is to move water throughout these plants, and the role of phloem is really to move sugars, proteins, and other dissolved solutes throughout the plant as well, because plants need to be able to move water up from the ground from their roots and up into the leaves, but they also need to be able to move photosynthates, so the sugars and things that they make during photosynthesis, back down to the rest of the plant. So they have these two different types of tissues, the xylem and the phloem, that are really critical in the transport of stuff in plants. Roots also play an important role in plant biology, in that they form, the roots are the source, or the site rather, of the formation of these what are called mycorrhizal associations, where plants and fungi are interacting in these subsoil environments, and the fungi allow the plant to access different nutrients, and they allow sort of greater surface area for the absorption of materials and water in the root system. So the development of roots true roots, not just the rootlets that we see in the bryophytes, but true root systems, greatly increases the ability of plants to interact with their environments for competitive advantage. Along with the development of vascular tissue and roots, we also see the development of leaves, sporophylls, and strobili, which are important structures in the advancement of plants being able to exploit these terrestrial habitats to outcompete the bryophytes and really start to exploit these new, basically untapped resources. Leaves provide huge amounts of surface area for the collection of light. That's an important consideration when your existence relies on the collection of light to produce the sugars that you need to survive. So the development of these leaf structures for photosynthesis is important. It's also important because these leaf structures also become modified as reproductive structures as well. These structures allow plants to have more sophisticated reproduction than the simple sorts of gamete productions that we see with the bryophytes. Right, there's a sort of very brief overview of what the beginning of this section has to offer. This chapter then moves into talking about the different sorts of seedless plants that we're going to talk about. And really what we're talking about with seedless vascular plants are ferns and their allies. Ferns and their allies really sort of came into their own about 300 million years ago, a little more. Think dinosaurs. The Carbonaceous period is called that because of the huge amounts of carbon that were trapped from the atmosphere and deposited underground. The coal reserves that humans use today to power our power plants and generate electricity to turn the lights on and the computers on and things like that all comes from ancient photosynthesis. Coal is trapped sunlight. That's what it is. It's photosynthesis 300 million years ago that gets trapped in geological layers, flattened and compressed, and we then dig it up later and burn it as energy. So it's important to understand that most of the energy systems on this planet, whether they're human-derived or naturally derived, are still driving on at least indirect photosynthesis. Now, there are a host of environmental issues associated with the mining and burning of coal, which, take environmental science or something like that if you want to learn more about that. But it's an important thing to understand that the ability for plants to grow these very large structures and can sort of hold this carbon in the form of fossilized coal is an important thing to understand about plants. And it really starts with these ferns in this era because those were the major plants that we had. We didn't have oak trees during the dinosaurs. They didn't exist. And so we had ferns and equisetum that reach really, really large sizes. So they don't exist anymore. They're extinct. But in that time, they did exist, and they represented a huge amount of biological life on this planet. Ferns are definitely the most well-known of these groups, but there are other components to this taxonomical group as well. First one that the book goes through are what are called the Lycophyta, the club mosses. These lycopods generally are, when you see them today, they tend to be very short growing. I've seen lots of them up, say, in northern Wisconsin. They tend to be small, sometimes in sort of aquatic habitats. These organisms represent these very early developments of vascular tissue, leaf-type structures, and things like that in these early vascular plants. The second group that we're going to talk about are the equisetums, or the horsetails. You may or may not be familiar with these organisms. You can see these growing in ditches in many different parts of the state of Iowa, as well as they are distributed globally as well. They tend to be sort of cylindrical looking. Some people call them scouring rushes. They can often become invasive into crop fields. I've seen that around here for sure. They do tend to hold into more aquatic habitats in today's world. And in fact, ancient swamps often have these equisetums as the major floral component to them. They're called horsetails because superficially they do kind of resemble, excuse me, a tail-like structure. They do have a sort of a long, robust stem with these joints at sections, and then these whorled leaves that come off and have this sort of tail-like appearance. But they're an interesting group of plants. They deposit silica into their cells, and that silica, which is the same as sand, it's the same molecule as sand. It provides an additional structural component to these plants that we don't really see in many other groups of plants. The next group that the book talks about are the whisk ferns. This is a very small group, both physically small, the plants themselves are small, and not a very diverse group as well, but an important component of this seedless vascular plant group. Moving past the whisk ferns, we then move into the true ferns, which when we think about ferns, these are probably what you're thinking about. You know, maybe your mom had a large fern plant in the living room, or ferns outside in the garden, or even if you're just thinking about the movie Jurassic Park, there's some really spectacular ferns in that movie. And these are really the most recognizable of the groups of seedless vascular plants. So they do not produce seeds, but they do have true vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, that we don't see in the bryophytes. This represents this advancement along this evolutionary path, which really confers these advantages when we're talking about evolutionary advantage, ability to access resources, both light and water, that we don't see in the bryophytes. Reproduction in ferns is interesting in that, it does not produce seeds. We're still producing spores like we saw in the bryophytes, except that in the case of ferns, these spores are produced in groups of sporangia called sori, which are underneath the leaves of a fern. If you've never noticed them before and there's a fern nearby, turn that leaf over and take a look. It looks like a series of dots underneath the leaf, and that's where this sporophyte generation leaf is producing these spores via meiosis and releasing these one-end gametophyte or gametes into the they're not gametes. They're releasing these one-end spores into their environment, where they land. If it's favorable, they start to grow and they form this gametophyte generation as an independent structure for the reproduction, for sexual reproduction of ferns. This gametophyte generation then produces antheridia and archegonia, which then produce sperm cells, which then, similar to the bryophytes, need this water in their environments to reproduce in that way. They don't have seeds. So it's still seedless reproduction. They still need water to reproduce, and that's why we generally see ferns mostly constrained to fairly damp or wet habitats. So again, we're getting this alternation of generations where we have this gametophyte generation, which is this independent structure from the sporophyte generation. And again, this is a strange sort of reproductive strategy if we're thinking about it in sort of human terms. We don't have any structures like this. This small but independent gametophyte generation goes off into the environment. It's one end, it lives, it produces gametes, fertilization occurs, and then the new sporophyte generation grows from the gametophyte as an independent structure. So these structures are linked and they're independent all at the same time. The alternation of generations is a fascinating reproductive strategy, and it really allows for plants to very well exploit their environments in the ways that are beneficial to them. Seedless vascular plants have a big importance in the environment. They provide this additional biodiversity to their systems. The seedless plants in general also are important. Bryophytes and mosses provide these early ecological steps towards succession and really allow for the colonization of more diverse habitats. All right. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk at you next week.